Imagine a world where you knew that you mattered and you belonged. The people cared about you because we were so darn good at listening to one another, no matter how different we are. That is what Sidewalk Talk is doing by putting listeners on sidewalks all over the world so that we can practice the art of connecting. Join me, founder and director Traci as I interview experts on the fine art of human connection and interview some of our volunteers who've been listening on the sidewalk and even some of the folks that we've listened to. And if you want to volunteer, consider joining us at sidewalk-talk.org. You know, ever since the pandemic has hit, I have wanted to talk to people who've lived a lot of life, and that's Philip Goldberg. And man, what a salt of the earth human. He's written a lot of books. He is a spiritual counselor. He's the real deal. He really is a Brooklyn guy who lived in Manhattan, New England, Pennsylvania, San Francisco, and Iowa. He kind of idealistically was trying to find his way in the 60s, expanding his mind, trying to figure out what love means, how to end racism and war. He was kind of relentless in his search, and he's written a lot of books, some that you might already be aware of. Yogananda is the one that I'm most aware of, an American Veda. But I'll tell you, he wrote one perfect timing for the rest of us called Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, Powerful Tools to Cultivate Calm, Clarity, and Courage. And what I loved about my conversation with Philip was his transparency and willingness to talk about, for example, I asked him about cultural appropriation and spirituality in the West. And he's just real. I love people like Philip. I feel like he walks his walk. And I can't wait to have you get to hear more about his life and get to listen in on our connection because it felt really, really sweet. So, Philip Goldberg, author of many, many books, but most currently, Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. Philip Goldberg, Traci Rubel, I'm so excited to get to talk with you. And we were talking beforehand that there was this synchronicity that we had, that I went to CIAS and that I studied transpersonal psychology, and some of your work around Yogananda was something that we were exposed to. So, wow, thank you for being here and all the work you do in the world. It's really cool stuff that you're into.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the welcome.
So, you've written this book called Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. I've heard you, I stalked you a little bit, so I've heard you talk about it. And you said, I didn't even know that the times were to get this crazy. So the timing on this book is just sort of luck. But do you knowing what I know about spirituality, do you think, though, that there was potentially some wiser guidance that had this get released right when we all seemed to need it?
I would not doubt it. But everybody's complimenting me on my impeccable timing, but and it is impeccable. I wish it weren't, because I wish there were not a pandemic and the book was just coming out in more ordinarily crazy times. I wrote it last year, and I started in the spring of 2019 because things were pretty crazy then.
Yeah.
If we think back, there was
been crazy for a while.
Yes, that's right. And there was a lot of bad stuff going on, scary stuff, and people were worried, and people were angry, and people were afraid. And I would run into people who were just sort of neglecting their usual spiritual practices because things were so, they were so agitated. And I kept thinking, no, it's the opposite. This is the time we need these practices more than ever. So I wrote the book, and bingo, we scheduled it for August of this year, and never knowing, just how much more crazy the world would become.
Yeah.
But maybe there was some divine work at play.
Yeah, I have to believe there is. I can sometimes, I'm going to be super honest, I can sometimes get turned off by spiritual practice types of books, but I want to read yours because you're kind of, you're kind of a rebel. And I kind of dig people that are rebels. So then I want to go, ooh, Philip is kind of a rebel. I'm kind of a rebel, so I'm going to actually want to see what spiritual practice Philip is inviting us all to do. But I wanted to ask you, because there's this association with spiritual practice that it's somebody that's sitting in robes, floating on a cloud with not much bothering them.
Yeah.
And why do we make that perception, and maybe how does that harm us from even engaging in spiritual practice if it does?
I've been fighting this battle for 50 years, and I want to thank you for calling me a rebel, because I would have rejoiced in that label back when I was a political activist in my student years in the 60s, and I haven't been called that in a while, so thank you.
Oh, good.
But I'm kind of a blend of, I honor tradition, spiritual tradition, when it's done with integrity and it remains useful and practical. And I'm unconventional in that I honor the individuality of everybody's spiritual perspective and spiritual path, and happily draw from anything that works. So what was your question again?
Well, I mean, I think that we have this misnomer that
Oh,
spiritual
right,
practice is
right.
only for people that want to float
Yeah.
around on a cloud, you know?
Yes, and it, there is a certain amount of escapism in every spiritual tradition, um, and people who need the excuse to disengage from the world will find ways to justify it in many of the spiritual teachings. But the truth is, most spiritual teachings that are aimed at the vast majority of humankind who are not hermits and who are not, uh, bliss ninnies living by themselves in a cave or a small ashram or something. Most of us are engaged in the world. We have families, we have jobs, we have communities, we're citizens. And the spiritual teachings that I value the most and that have had the most impact are the ones that acknowledge that you can have a deep spiritual life in the midst of it all, and that spiritual foundation is not an escape from the world, except temporarily, when you take time out to meditate or pray or do your yoga or whatever you do. But those temporary retreats and the taking refuge, the finding inner peace as a self-protective mechanism against the ravages of the world, you then come out into the world. And spiritual practices give us a stronger foundation of strength and inner stability and calmness of mind, so we can engage in the world without losing our stability, and thereby being more effective. And this is an important factor, especially for people who want to make a difference in the world. It's not escapism. It's an investment of time to do these practices, to gain the strength and wisdom and clarity and inner peace that makes you more effective in the world. People like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, all the great, activists who had a spiritual foundation, they all knew this. And so it's an important lesson for all of us to be reminded of.
Yeah, what I hear you saying is that it's like this source of refueling so that you could get back out there and do the good work in a way.
Exactly. It's both self-protection
Mm.
and a reboot, a restart. So you go out there. I'm a sports fan, and we're recording this in the middle of the World Series and just after the NBA playoffs here in America. And I watch these athletes, and the ones I admire the most, the ones who teammates admire the most, are the ones who, when the pressure is on and there's tension and anxiety, they're the ones who retain their cool and they perform with excellence.
Mm.
And by analogy, we can do the same in the midst of difficulties, in the midst of challenges, in the midst of the ups and downs of the world. We can retain some inner stability, keep our cool, and therefore be, whatever we do in the world, be better parents, be better doctors, be better bus drivers, whatever it is.
Mm.
We will do it with a little more equanimity and a little more compassion and a little more clarity, and therefore make smarter decisions instead of flying off the handle because we're angry or getting so nervous we mess things up.
Yep. Yep. This makes sense. One of the things that I wrestled with when I was you and I talked about CIS before we started recording, I wrestled with this idea of where there was room for anger in our spiritual life.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know if where you fall on that, but it's been a question that I've wondered, does spiritual life mute our anger and sort of tone police us, or does it help us turn that anger into something that's more effective? I'm just curious to riff with you a little bit about that.
I'm in the latter camp. I wrote a piece about that. In fact, I wrote a piece about that, and it's one of the reasons my publisher said, let's do a book. And I included in Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. I talk about converting toxic emotions into something that could be channeled in a constructive way, and anger is a critical one. If we're consumed, I'm not saying don't get angry. That would be phony baloney stuff.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, by the
Sometimes,
way.
no, really, sometimes there's a reason to be angry. I
Yeah.
mean, anger is a defense. It's an evolutionary defense mechanism. It alerts us to something that's threatening. And so anger can be, it can tell us something needs our attention.
Yeah.
But if we're filled with rage, we know from our own experience, whether it's getting upset at our child's temper tantrum or our spouse or our coworker or whatever, when we act in the midst of rage, we usually say things and do things we later regret. We make things worse. But if you can take that rage and allow it to settle a bit, and there are spiritual practices to do this, so that you can then have some clarity of thought and look at it and say, what's going on? What needs my attention? And maybe convert rage into something more useful, like indignation. That term, righteous indignation. People, I mentioned Martin Luther King before. He was angry. He had good reason to be angry, but he didn't, lash out in rage. He channeled that anger into righteous indignation and good strategy and useful tactics to channel it and make a difference. And I think so. Anger has its uses, but we have to convert it and channel it and reframe it so that this is one of the reasons I emphasize in my book that the spiritual can be practical. It can be more practical than ignoring the spiritual dimension of life.
Oh, that's really cool. Say that again. So spirituality.
The spiritual can be practical because it makes us better human beings. It
You
makes
said
us
it's,
more effective
but what
human
I love
beings.
what you said is it's even more practical than ignoring, which is
Yeah,
so
yes.
swimming
If you
upstream when you
yes,
say that.
if you ignore the spiritual dimension of your life, however you may define it, and
Mm-hmm.
there's, infinite numbers of approaches to what we call the spiritual. But I'm grateful to you for getting us to reject the image of spirituality as pie in the sky, fantasy world, sitting under a tree in lotus position, ignoring the world. There's value in sitting under a tree.
Sure. Yeah.
But we get up and we return to the world. I always joke that spiritual people sometimes fantasize about leaving the world and going to live in an ashram or some cabin in the woods. And I think, but you're going to have to go shopping. You're going to have to buy food. You're going to get pissed off at the person in the next room. You're going to have to, shelter yourself and get clothes. You're a human being interacting in the world. And by engaging in effective spiritual practices, we can be better human beings. It's as
Yeah.
simple
No,
as that.
it totally makes sense. So there are some zeitgeist spiritual practices right now. I mean, mindfulness is everywhere. Yoga is kind of everywhere. What is in store for folks though when they pick up spiritual practice for crazy times? A couple little things that maybe people have never heard of, but that you find to be kind of effective and practical and super cool.
Well, I'm a big advocate of deep meditation practices. I mean, most of the book is practical guidance and techniques, instructions, advice. I drew from many spiritual traditions, but especially the ones that come to us via India. And I try to use the ones, especially the ones that have some verification in modern research by psychology and neurophysiology and that sort of thing. So I have methods for establishing a regular spiritual practice, which I strongly recommend, a deep spiritual practice. And I have a lot about how to distinguish the various different forms of meditation and mindfulness, because they're not all the same. They're not all right. There's no one right one for every person. But I favor the ones that don't require a tremendous amount of mind control or effort, because the effortless ones are much more relaxing and calming. And I have, one thing that I think is important in the book is I recommend regular daily practice, and I have guidelines for that, but also interventions for other times of day when we might need, a 1 minute practice, a 5 minute practice, or anything up to, taking a long retreat. And so I have guidance for arranging in time intervals, creating an inventory of practices that work for you, so that you can draw on them as needed in the moment when things hit the fan and things are crazy, at other periods of your life when you might have time to go to a sacred place, have to work with your relationships so they are more supportive of inner peace and spiritual practice. I also like to expand the definition of spiritual practice.
Yeah.
So for example, in those short time intervals, you're upset, things are crazy, you're at the office, whatever, you only have a few minutes. What can you do? There's many things you can do. You can do breathing practices. You can get on the floor and stretch. You can put on a song. And it doesn't have to be a so-called spiritual song. You can put on a rock song or a jazz song or a hip hop song, anything that uplifts you and is good for your soul. That in that moment is spiritual. It's sacred. It's what if we bring to it the proper attitude.
Yeah. You're giving, I'm having a reverie right now of an unusual practice. So after George Floyd's murder, we had a kind of a famous jazz singer here in Berlin lead 50 or 60 of our Sidewalk Talk volunteers in song. And we just said songs together. And people from all different faiths and backgrounds and traditions. And I remember just feeling so much better because you could almost feel the, in my body as I was singing. And it was funny because we were all on Zoom and we couldn't get the sound, you can't get the sync up exactly right. So we put ourselves on mute and she was singing. And my husband said, "You were singing so loud that the people at the bus stop could hear you and they were laughing at you." So, well, hopefully they got some benefit from my spiritual practice too. But who knew that singing songs, I mean, it makes sense because we do that in churches for years and years and years.
Yes. And in India, there's this group chanting of Sanskrit mantras, and it's ecstatic and it's beautiful and it's lovely. Gospel choirs, Gregorian chants. I mean, but then there's just good old singing. Sing a show tune. Think of, for example, "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning."
Yeah.
It is an old corny Rodgers and Hammerstein song that was revolutionary.
Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. That one, right?
I feel better already. I mean, I'm uplifted. It's like, it's beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, you're just, what's happening is I'm making these connections to things that I might not have thought were spiritual. And I'm going, oh, right, they're spiritual. You know what else I've been doing lately, Philip? I have been coloring in the morning.
Oh, wow.
I just have needed, it's a lot like song. I've needed an element of play and something that's kind of not linear.
Yes, and that reminds me of another thing that I included in spiritual practice for crazy times: the importance of art. The viewing art, not just visual art, but drama, reading great novels, reading poetry, of course, music, which we've already talked about, but not just taking in great art, but doing art. So you mentioned coloring. People might draw, people might, bang on a drum, sing. These can be spiritual acts if we bring, the best of our inner life to it. I always say that whether something is spiritual depends as much on what you bring to it as the thing itself. There's no funny line that says if sitting in church and thinking you're spiritual is like sitting in a garage and thinking you're a car.
Right.
It's what you bring to it. Some people, go to church on Sunday morning because it's obligatory, and they'd much rather be home watching the football game, and they're not there. They're not really there in a holy place. But, some other people can be, just taking a walk in a park, and it's a sacred experience. It's what you bring to it. I live in Los Angeles. I live close enough to the ocean to take walks on the beach, easily.
Yeah.
It's the same beach every day when I go there. It's a beautiful beach. People come from all over the world to walk in the beach of Venice and Santa Monica, and I walk on the beach. And some days it's like ecstasy. I'm at one with the environment, and it's so beautiful and it's so wonderful. And I'm so grateful. Other days I might as well be walking in an alleyway in some grungy city, because I'm not bringing the best of myself to it. I'm not perceiving the sacredness of that moment. So a lot of it is what we bring to it.
I appreciate you saying that, because I've shared with some of the Sidewalk Talk listeners, I can't say that it happens every time I go sit out on a sidewalk and listen. Sometimes I'm cold or
Yeah.
distracted, or I'm like, oh, I feel like I have to do a good job. But there are times where I do manage to bring that level of intentionality that you're describing. And yet, I often think of spiritual practice as something that's very private between
Yeah.
me and me. But here I'm having this kind of ecstatic spiritual experience listening to another human soul.
Because you're bringing that open heart and empathy and compassion and receptivity. And I would just add that regular spiritual practice increases the odds that a person will have those qualities when needed. It
Mm,
doesn't guarantee anything, but generally speaking, and the research bears this out,
yeah.
regular spiritual practices, the deep ones that really connect us with what I call the sanctuary of peace within us, the more you do those, the more your own innate compassion and empathy, the capacity for love, the openness, the feeling of mutuality and connectedness with other people, those things tend to be enhanced
Yeah.
over time. And because if you go to those experiences in an agitated, upset, selfish frame of mind, you won't be bringing the same qualities.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's well said. I want
And
to
but
ask.
I'll also let me, if I may, I'll
Yeah.
also add that what you're talking about, this wonderful sidewalk talk you're doing, that in itself is a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Certainly can be. I mean, look what you're bringing to other human beings. You're doing service, and that's one of the forms of spiritual practice I write about in the book. Getting out of your ego, getting out of yourself,
Yeah.
and doing something for somebody else.
Hmm.
There's a tremendous amount of research that shows that your own well-being is enhanced by doing service like that, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And that's a spiritual practice, and the world needs as much of it as we can bring it.
You just kind of nailed it. I was sort of reflecting as you were talking. It's what it happens when I have those experiences on the sidewalk is because I'm listening so well that I'm actually sort of surrendered my ego. It's not that I'm merging with the other person and becoming a big ball of we. I'm still intact, but
Yes,
my ego is not leading the conversation or leading the
yes,
listening. And it's such a relief. I mean, it feels beautiful.
yes. And and you're in good company with that. Some of the great sages of all time have said, they have made service, what in India is called seva,
Mm,
selfless service, a part of the repertoire of spiritual practices they bring to their
mm,
followers. This is every spiritual tradition that I know of has some element of service
mm.
as part of its mission and regular thing. For this very reason, it's not only making a contribution to the world, it's also serving the servers,
Hmm.
the people who do service.
Yeah.
There's a great quote from Tagore about that.
Mm.
Um,
I can hear you on
Here it
mute.
is. I found it in
Oh
my
my God,
very own
so
book.
fast.
I knew the chapter
It
it
was
was in.
synchronicity again, see?
Yes, it was, but I flipped right to it. Rabindranath Tagore. I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I woke and saw that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy.
Wow, that's a big circle.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So yes, and there's much service needed these days.
Okay, you and I are getting all touchy-feely, but can I ask you can I ask you a rebellious question?
Please.
All right. Here's what's come up in some of my circles and certainly came up when I was at CIS, which is this concept of appropriation.
Yes.
And I know you've spoken quite eloquently, and I think you are masterful at describing, how do we make use of other cultures' spiritual traditions, how have it elevate us and all those things without unduly harming or appropriating something
Yeah.
as we tend to do.
This is delicate stuff.
Yeah.
So I want to be careful in what I say. I think appropriation is a legitimate concern, and it's here in the U.S. and probably in Western Europe as well. It's especially focused on the use, the adoption of spiritual principles and methodologies that come to us from the East, especially nowadays yoga and mindfulness, meditation. And it's a legitimate concern. At the same time, the whole of world history and progress in different spheres of life is features cultures borrowing from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So, we eat pizza in America, and they eat hamburgers in Italy. And, Indians drive cars that were invented in America. They took the technology of motion pictures that was invented in the US, and they made Bollywood of it. They, computer technologies and software engineers. So this borrowing back and forth is eternal, and it's served the world very well. Then, of course, there's the dark side. There's stealing of things. There's inappropriate use of things. But if you look at spiritual teachings in the same way we look at technologies or elements of culture like food and clothing and musical forms, look at the mix of musical forms that bring us, so much joy. My favorite, my ringtone on my phone is John Coltrane playing.
I love John Coltrane.
Yes, but the song is a Rodgers and Hammerstein song. My favorite things, this ditty little thing. He turned it into fabulous jazz. And that kind of borrowing and interchange is, enriches us. Mm-hmm. So if you look at spiritual practices like yoga and meditation and mindfulness and all these things, in the same way we look at cultural exchanges and technologies, then it's part of the fabric of modern life.
Yeah.
And I would point out, as I do in my books, in American Veda and my biography of Yogananda, it was the teachers coming here from India who brought these ideas and these techniques and methods, not just India, but if you look at Buddhism, all the Buddhist cultures, Tibet and Japan and so forth, they brought this wisdom and these practical methods to the West and trained Westerners to carry on their legacies. So are those Westerners who were certified and trained by, genuine yogis and swamis and roshis, are they appropriating? No, they're honoring their tradition. But then there's misuses and things that degrade those techniques. So we have to be careful and judge it on an individual basis. And as far as I'm concerned, the main thing is, are the teachings being transmitted with integrity, or are they being diluted and distorted and corrupted for commercial purposes?
Well, I think that was a big bingo right there, that last statement.
Yeah.
I mean, that's about it. That's about intention, what I hear you saying.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and misuse.
Yeah.
And or lack of integrity.
Something's coming up in my heart as I listen to you too. I'm mashing up. I'm appropriating from some of our other podcast guests. I remember when Howard C. Stevenson was on, he said, you've got to know where you come from. Mm-hmm. And I think that, like when you were talking about John Coltrane, sort of playing the Haberstein songs. I don't even know how do you say it? The song that I was singing earlier. You said John Coltrane was doing the cover of that.
My favorite things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but you honor and know where that John Coltrane song actually came from. I could feel you come alive, and I felt this adoration. You knew the source.
Yes. And that's important. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
There are people doing mindfulness and yoga and secularizing them and, making them more commercially palatable.
Yeah.
And that in itself is not a bad thing, because, a lot of the gurus did the same thing. Yogananda, made his teachings more palatable. He learned how to communicate to the Western mind and what they were interested in. But he did not compromise on the integrity of the teachings themselves. And he honored where it came, of course, because he came from there. Mm-hmm. And the people who teach in lineages always, most of them do honor the source.
Yeah.
But other people don't. And they don't want you to know, oh, this came from Buddhism. Oh, this came from, the rishis of India. They just want to, and that, I think, is it's offensive to people from those cultures, and it also increases the chances that the teachings will be corrupted.
Well, and I'm actually having aside from feeling the offensiveness of it, I'm having a new awareness in the moment, in real time, which is that the experience of the practice is richer when we take the time to honor the source. Like, I can feel it in my body even as we're talking about it right now. I'm like, oh, right.
Absolutely.
It deepens. It's not about trying not to appropriate to be a good person. It's about a deep sense of holding honor in the body.
That's a very good point. Every once in a while I'm asked to give a talk to people who are training to be yoga teachers. Mm. And, a lot of them are very unaware of the depth and profundity of the tradition that they're working in. They just see it as exercise. Yeah. And so one of my tasks is to let them know that, by teaching in the name of yoga, they are essentially, making themselves part of an honorable lineage with many branches and tributaries that go back to some of the wisest and most brilliant people in the world, and a cultural context that they should recognize and honor and feel, grateful for being part of.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? It's just, I'm sorry, I'm making all these connections. I'm getting super excited. Like, it doesn't matter the spiritual tradition either. I mean, we could talk about the ones that Western culture is more, I mean, it's the same with like Jesus Christ. You kind of got to like go back and honor the guy and what he actually stood for, not just appropriate his teachings. And when you do, you're more closely aligned with what the intention of that whole philosophy is, right?
Yes. And I wish that certain Christian leaders these days would go back and align themselves more closely with the great teacher they claim to be representing.
Yeah. Well, my other field of study was political science, and one of the things that I guess has made me wary about religion, having grown up in a very fundamentalist home.
Did you?
I did. Was that religion, as it became appropriated by the state, made people cheaper to police.
Oh, yeah, and that's probably true.
So I think that this was just a really fun conversation.
Well, I grew up in exactly the opposite. I grew up with sort of atheist parents who thought religion was the opium of the people. Mm-hmm. And I had no religious training whatsoever. The only time religion ever came up was essentially to complain about religious people.
Right. To complain about me, essentially. Because I was one of them, I'm telling you.
Or, overly pious Catholics and Jews that I grew up in New York, with a lot of that. And so I had a very cynical attitude toward religion and its effects on the world that I had to unlearn. And you probably had to unlearn your fundamentalism.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Well, this was wonderful. So I am going to go pick up American Veda too, after talking to you and some of the things that we talked about early on. But I will make sure for all of those listening, I'm going to put a bunch of links to not just Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, but some of Philip's books, because he's been studying world spiritual traditions for 50 years. I think it's like over 25 books that you've either contributed to, been a part of, written. I mean, you've got quite a lot of offerings for the rest of us to kind of expand our own souls. So I thank you for that.
I hope you include my website.
I will include all the things. Are you kidding? Beth's got us teed up. But I mentioned to you that we have a little bit of a ritual that is kind of a sweet thing that all of the listeners have gotten used to, how we close a conversation with every guest that we invite over. You and I just had tea. You've been in my house having tea with me. And it's I want to introduce you to the other guests at the table and just offer to have you speak directly to them. Any words of wisdom or a wish to those 8,500 listeners that sit on sidewalks and listen to people around the world?
I will. I'm honored to be with you. I have tremendous admiration and respect for what you do. I would encourage you to remember that deep within yourselves, deep within all of us, at our core, our essence, is a sanctuary of peace and a fortress of strength, and that there are many methods through which we can access that sanctuary on a regular basis and as needed. And by doing so, we can bring more of the best parts of ourselves, our love, our compassion, our inner peace, our joy, our openness, our empathy, to the world and to the other people we connect with. And certainly able to do that on a more consistent basis than we would otherwise. The spiritual, what we call the spiritual, is also very practical. And I hope you bring the best of yourselves with you when you speak to those people and hear them and listen to them from a big, joyful, compassionate heart.
Spoken straight from your heart. I could feel it. What a delight to be together. Thank you for this book and for the time together, Philip.
Thank you, Traci. It's been a joy.
Yeah. Be well, okay?
You too.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of the Sidewalk Talk podcast. If you like what you heard, tell your friends, tell your family, like and comment on the podcast publisher that you're listening from, and subscribe. This will help us get the word out about changing our culture to one of